Let's talk about administration and absorption of the benzodiazepines and barbiturates, or tranquilizers, anxiolytics, and sedative hypnotics. In general, how the drug is administered is going to depend on the purpose for which the drug is given. In other words, how urgent is it to relieve the symptoms? So, of course, when you want a rapid effect, the route of administration is going to be IV or intravenously. So, for example, if someone is so agitated that they might cause harm to themselves or someone else, then of course you want the drug into the bloodstream very, very quickly. Same case if you need to sedate someone. Say, for example, if someone has been in a very traumatic accident, etc., then it's often better to sedate that person if they're experiencing a lot of trauma and so forth. So in that case, you would want the drug to be administered intravenously. If you want a longer lasting effect, then of course the drug would be administered orally in pill form. And then you remember that when things are administered orally, the majority of the absorption is going to happen through the digestive tract. Okay? And so in probably all but the emergency situations where immediate action is needed, then these drugs are generally administered orally. Okay? And again, things that are administered orally, the majority of the absorption is going to occur through the digestive tract. Okay? So, properties associated with this drug, or these drugs, the benzodiazepines, barbiturates, tranquilizers, anxiolytics, sedative hypnotics, these drugs are generally readily absorbed from the digestive tract and from injection sites. They generally have high lipid solubility. Okay? And the interesting thing is that we've kind of hinted at earlier in the part 1, is that there is a range of lipid solubility among these drugs. Okay? So different benzodiazepine drugs have different lipid solubilities. Different barbiturate drugs have different lipid solubilities. So you have ranges of lipid solubility. And these differences in lipid solubility account for the differences in the speed of absorption, or the differences in how quickly these drugs are absorbed, or the differences in how quickly these drugs reach a site of action and produce their effects. Okay? So obviously, the more lipid soluble a drug is, the more quickly it's going to be absorbed, the more quickly it's going to produce its effects. So let's talk a little bit about distribution and excretion. So the major determinant of the distribution and excretion of barbiturates and benzodiazepines is going to be lipid solubility. Okay. So one of the things that you probably can make a notation of for this chapter is that there are going to be two major things in this chapter. One is lipid solubility, because that's always going to come back. That's going to affect how quickly these drugs get into the bloodstream. That lipid solubility is going to be one of the factors that influence the duration of action for these drugs. So lipid solubility is one of the major themes in this chapter on anxiolytics and sedative hypnotics. The other theme, as you're going to see a little bit later, is going to be inhibition. Okay? But let's go back. So the major determinant of the distribution and excretion of barbiturates and benzodiazepines, or the major determinant of the distribution and excretion of anxiolytics and sedative hypnotics, is lipid solubility. Okay? So the lipid solubility will affect the duration of action. The more lipid soluble a drug is, the longer it can stay in the bloodstream. Remember back in chapter 1 when we talk about things that once they enter the bloodstream and have produced their effects, been delivered to sites of actions, etc., that once they reach the level of the nephrons and the kidneys, then the same characteristics, are they small, are they neutral, are they lipid soluble? And things that are lipid soluble get recirculated, or reabsorbed, and get to re-enter into circulation. But one of the things that we're going to see with the anxiolytics and sedative hypnotics is that because of their lipid solubility, they also hang out in fatty areas of the body and then get redistributed from the fat. Okay, so their lipid solubility is going to affect the duration of action. The more lipid soluble you are, or the drug is, then the longer the duration of action. Okay, so I've kind of skipped ahead a little bit. The drugs are, I mentioned that the drugs are so lipid soluble that they get redistributed into fatty areas of the body. Okay, and so when some of the drug gets redistributed into the fatty areas of the body, then obviously the blood levels of the drug are going to drop. Okay, because you've got some of the drug that is now in the fatty areas of the body. So that decreases the amount that's in the bloodstream, okay? But what's going to happen is that the drug that's in the bloodstream is going to be metabolized, okay? And so as that gets metabolized, the blood levels of the drug are going to drop pretty quickly. But then what's going to happen is that some of the drug that's been trapped in the fatty areas of the body is going to get redistributed from the fat back out into the bloodstream. And so you're still going to see metabolism happening, but it's going to be a bit slower because as what's in the blood is metabolized, you've got more fat that's being released from the fat back out into the bloodstream. Okay, and that's part of that concept of simple diffusion, because as the levels in the bloodstream drop, that's a low concentration, and then you've got high concentrations of the drug in the fat areas. And so simple diffusion, things are going to move from an area of high concentration in the fat to an area of low concentration back out to the bloodstream. But then the liver is going to do its job, secrete enzymes that's going to metabolize that and lower the levels of drug that are in the bloodstream. Okay. One of the things that we need to remember, or be aware of rather, is that the duration of action for the anxiolytics and sedative hypnotics, for the benzodiazepines and the barbiturate drugs, is not always dependent on just the half-life of these drugs, okay? And that's because these drugs have active metabolites that are also very lipid soluble and also have long half-lives. So we have to consider the parent drug, or the drug that was taken, but then once that gets broken down, it gets broken down into a substance that is very lipid soluble, that's active, and that has a long half-life. Okay? So the things that can affect the duration of action, of course, are going to be the lipid solubility of the parent drug, the half-life of that parent drug, but also the lipid solubility and the half-life of these active metabolites. Okay? And so that's drawing back on those concepts from chapter 1 when we talk about the potential consequences of metabolism. You could end up with the substance that's active just like the parent drug. And so this is a case where you have metabolites that are active and also very lipid soluble and also have long half-lives. So let's talk about how the benzodiazepines and barbiturates produce their effects, how these anxiolytics and sedative hypnotics produce their effects. Okay, so first we're going to recall how these drugs are alike in what they do. Okay, remember we said that these drugs are GABA agonists. Okay, remember agonists mimic actions. So these drugs increase GABAergic transmission. They increase the transmission of the major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. They're GABA agonists. Okay, so they are they are alike in how they produce their effects, in that the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines indirectly, influence the functioning of GABA by opening up the chloride ion channels that are associated with GABA. So they can both indirectly activate the chloride ion channels that are associated with GABA. Okay? Now, how would they they dissimilar in how they produce their effects? Okay? At high enough doses, the barbiturate drugs can directly influence those chloride ion channels that are associated with the GABA receptor. Okay? So they're alike in that they both can indirectly influence the functioning of GABA by indirectly influencing those chloride ion channels associated with the GABA receptor. They're dissimilar because barbiturates at high enough doses can directly influence the chloride ion channels that are associated with the GABA receptor. Okay? So, what we want to think about now is what is the end result of how they do what they do? What is the end result of influencing the functioning of GABA? What's the end result of opening up those chloride ion channels that are associated with GABA? Okay? And the answer is hyperpolarization. Okay? By opening up those chloride ion channels, you're sending more negative ions into the inside of the cell, which means that the cell is now harder to excite. So the cell membrane becomes hyperpolarized. Okay? Remember, these drugs are central nervous system depressants, and they do that by hyperpolarizing membranes. Okay? And that hyperpolarization is what's associated with the behavioral effects that we see, because the membranes are harder to excite. You see decreased agitation, you see sedation, okay, or aiding the ability to get to sleep. Okay? But one of the things that you want to make sure you do when we talk about the end result of how they do what they do, we're talking about the physiological end result, not the behavioral end result. Of course, the behavioral end result is going to be a less anxious individual or an individual that's able to get to sleep. But the end result of how they do it is that hyperpolarization or that depression of the central nervous system. Okay? Now, this is just a little cartoon of the GABA receptor, and I'm a little remiss here. I should have put GABA A receptor, but it's a complex that has 5, we call them pentamers because it's 5 complexes that are, or 5 subunits that are associated with the receptor. And on the receptor, on this receptor, you actually have a spot for GABA. Okay? You have a receptor specifically for barbiturates, and then you have a receptor for benzodiazepine drugs where they will bind. And then, of course, in the middle of this pentamer is the chloride ion channel. So, again, when GABA occupies its receptor, these chloride ion channels open, sending negative ions into the cell. When benzodiazepines bind to their receptor, this chloride ion channel opens, sending negative ions into the cell. When barbiturates at low to moderate doses bind to its receptor, these chloride channels are open, sending negative ions into the cell. But remember, at high enough doses, barbiturates don't have to actually bind to the receptor. They can directly influence the opening of this chloride ion channel. Okay? So let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about some of the general effects that are associated with the benzodiazepine and barbiturate drugs. Okay, and just a reminder, remember our benzodiazepines are our tranquilizers and our anxiolytics in general, and the barbiturate drugs are our sedative hypnotics. So first we're going to talk about the effects on the autonomic centers of the brain, particularly the medulla, or the area that's responsible for respiration. Okay, barbiturate drugs can suppress the center of the brain that's responsible for breathing. In general, if an individual is healthy, then the benzodiazepines don't have a significant effect on respiration. Okay? These drugs are useful as anticonvulsants and in blocking seizures. Generally, the benzodiazepine drugs have some usefulness in this way. Typically, the barbiturate drugs are more useful or more effective in treating that. And I think your textbook says that it's unlikely that the benzodiazepines would replace the barbiturates in terms of long-term use for an individual that has recurring seizures. Okay. These drugs can also be used as muscle relaxants. I have actually had to take some before when I've had problems with my back years ago. But these are generally useful as muscle relaxants. Okay, but when you have the benzodiazepine drugs that are being used for the treatment of anxiety, etc., then sometimes one of the side effects is going to be ataxia, okay, or discoordinated movement because of these muscle relaxant properties. If the individual loses some muscle control. Okay. For the benzodiazepines only, they tend to increase appetite, and so you can see some weight gain that's associated with the use of benzodiazepines. Okay. Now, here what I've tried to do is to combine some of the effects of these drugs together. In terms of sleep, you have a decreased latency to fall asleep, which means that you fall asleep more quickly. Okay, taking a barbiturate, which is a sleep aid, or a high enough dose of an anxiolytic drug can also do that. And so you'll see that when we've combined some of these effects, that's why I wanted to, at the top of the chapter, talk about some of the historical reasons that these drugs were developed and what they were initially used for, because they can be used for many different things today. But again, you have a decreased latency to fall asleep, which means you fall asleep more quickly. Okay. You have decreased wakefulness, so it means you're staying asleep, not waking up as much. And you have increased total sleep time. Okay. So you fall asleep more quickly, wake up less, and sleep longer. The problem is that you have a decreased percentage of time that's spent in REM. Okay, REM is the rapid eye movement phase of sleep. This is considered to be the restorative phase of sleep, or the phase of sleep that's necessary for a person to feel well rested when they wake up. And what the sleep aids and the anxiolytics do is that they interfere with the amount of time that's spent in REM sleep. And so a person is asleep, but it's not a restful sleep. And so a person could still wake up tired or fatigued in the morning. Okay? Some of the subjective effects on performance. Of course, sedation and fatigue can be experienced. You often have individuals that report euphoria, and it's the euphoria is more likely to be reported in people who have a history with alcohol use. It's not clear why these individuals are more likely to report the euphoria, but that happens to be the case. Okay, you have effects on visual and auditory functioning. You have deficits in visual functions in terms of fusion thresholds and things like that. So what the individual is able to see and how easily they're able to pick out stimuli. And similarly, you have deficits in auditory function. Okay. You've also got some pretty significant effects on memory, even at low doses. Perhaps you have heard stories about people who are on various sleep aids who have woke up in the middle of the night and driven cars, or woke up in the middle of the night and cooked an entire meal, but then had no memory of those things happening. And so you've got anterograde amnesia that's associated with use of these drugs, meaning that the individual does not have a recollection or memory of what happened during the time that they were on the drug, that they can remember things that happened before. You've also got, some problems with verbal memory, recalling digits if it's mathematical, things like that. But some pretty significant effects on memory, even at the low doses. Okay. Residual effects happens to be a problem that's associated with these drugs, and particularly the older drugs. Some of those drugs were so lipid soluble that you had significant carryover effects in the morning, where individuals were not able to get up and go to work or to operate vehicles and things like that. So their lipid solubility, the fact that they're so lipid soluble, a lot of them have the increased half-lives, and so you have effects that are often, experienced, many hours after the drug has been taken. Then, of course, the effects are dose dependent. The larger the dose, the more likely the individual is to experience some of those carryover effects or impairments. And then, of course, there's an influence on the effects of alcohol. Remember, alcohol at high doses is itself a sedative hypnotic. And then if you're taking a sedative hypnotic, then those effects are what we call synergistic. So 1 + 1 is 3. It's not 2. The effects are greater than what you would experience. And so, very risky to drink while taking these drugs. Okay? And then, of course, there are driving impairments that have been reported with use of these drugs. Oftentimes the individual is not really aware of how impaired that they actually are. But you have, some types of driving impairments that might be associated with other sedative hypnotics like alcohol that are associated with use of these drugs. Okay. This slide is talking about the benzodiazepines, not necessarily the barbiturate drugs. The benzodiazepines are your tranquilizers, your anxiolytics. These are effective in reducing anxiety-related symptoms in about 70 to 80% of the people who have symptoms. So this means that of individuals suffering with anxiety-related disorders, you've got 20 to 30% of those individuals who are not responding to the current medications. Okay, and there are a couple of reasons that might be. Okay, their symptoms vary. Okay, I am not very good with keeping current on the changes in the diagnostic manual. But the last time I checked, there were over 32 different types of anxiety-related disorders. Okay, but you could have two people who are diagnosed with generalized anxiety or general anxiety disorder, but those two individuals could have very different symptoms. But we treat those two the same in terms of medications oftentimes. And so, we're expecting people to respond even though their symptoms are not the same. Okay, so the analogy that I use is that you could have two individuals that have broken bones. One could have a hairline fracture, the other could have a pretty significant break. We certainly would not want those two to be treated the same, but that's sort of what we do with a lot of disorders when we have a limited number of medications, but the symptoms are very variable. Okay, so symptoms could vary, and that could account for why some people are responsive to medications and others are not. One of the other things that might account for some of the differences are patients' other defenses. Sometimes individuals have coping mechanisms. So if we're talking about anxiety-related disorders again, sometimes individuals will recognize if there's a situation that might bring about a panic attack, and so they may decide to count to 10 or to take deep breaths, and so they may have other coping mechanisms that in concert with use of their medication makes them more responsive. Patients might also have support in the form of family members or friends that seem to improve their treatment outcomes. Okay, and then finally, sometimes personality plays a big role. I'm sure you've all experienced a person who is just determined to be miserable, even if things seem to be going well. And so sometimes the person's attitude and their outlook can have an influence on how responsive they are to the medication.